What's going on YouTube? So in front of me we have the 2015 Victory Highball and my 2009 R6. We just got back from a road trip. We put about 6,000 kilometers on both of these bikes. After spending more time on my Victory, I am going to be listing it for sale, and this video is going to be a breakdown of everything I like and don't like specifically on the bike. It's not really a video I was expecting to make, but I'm going to share my thoughts with you guys. And just keep in mind, all my thoughts on this Victory are coming from a diehard sport bike rider. Like, I have the Aprilia RSV4 right here. I bought my very first crotch rocket. It was back in 2011. It was a 2004 CBR 1000 RR. So I've been riding sport bikes majority of my life, well over a decade. And this Victory is my first cruiser style motorcycle. It's fully set up, stage 1, intake, exhaust. It's got the Lloyd's ignition timing wheel on it. It's got the Lloyd's quarter turn throttle. It's been dyno tuned with a Power Commander 5. So a pretty basic setup. And I really wanted to see if it could hang with the sport bikes while we're crushing back canyon roads and pushing this bike to the absolute limit. Let me start off by saying this Victory is a great motorcycle, great value for what you get. 106 cubic inch engine, relatively cheap to buy, extremely reliable. 95% of people buying this motorcycle would probably fall in love with it. And I do really enjoy riding it, especially just hop on it quick, ride to work, very comfortable, nice seating position, great visibility out of the mirrors, can see everything behind you. Lots of cheap accessories like this LED headlamp I put on, 50 bucks. It performs way better than sport bike headlights. These bikes are very simple, easy to work on. A lot of things I do like. The belt drive, that belt's original, still looks pretty much brand new. This bike has about 30,000 kilometers on it now. While we go over to the R6, a lot more maintenance required on a sport bike like this. Chain and sprocket on this bike are pretty much garbage after our trip, completely worn out. And while we're mentioning everything I like about the Victory, the thing I'm impressed with most is the fuel mileage. This is a 106 cubic inch engine and it gets way better fuel mileage. Even if I'm wide open throttle trying to keep up, every time we fuel up, I burnt about $3 to $5 less in the Victory and get way further to a tank than the R6, which blew me away. This bike is way heavier, engine is 3 times the size, literally, and better fuel mileage. Extremely impressive. But with that being said, let's get into the details of where this bike falls short compared to the crotch rockets. So just to give you some info on our trip, we traveled all across the States, right from sea level on the Oregon coast, all the way up through Beartooth Pass, 12,000 feet elevation, all riding conditions, rain, we just missed snow, plus 37 heat. We went through everything. And I rode this bike to the absolute limit, crushing back canyon roads. We never hit any main roads really, kind of as tight and curvy roads as we could find on every single route every day. First thing that I was really disappointed with was the lean angle. If you come and look at these pegs always have these little fingers on the bottom of them. Of course, you're not gonna drag peg on the crotch rocket because they're so high up. But coming over to the Victory, it had fingers as well, and I ripped them off pretty much immediately. You can see it's a little threaded hole in there. It actually broke and yeah, completely ripped off. When I'm hitting corners on this bike, these pegs get forced up and it pushes your feet off the motorcycle. So you're kind of holding your feet suspended in the air when you're cornering hard. And I even touched frame in a couple spots. Right here, and on the back here, kissed the frame there as well. Came extremely close to low siding this motorcycle, and I wasn't even going that fast. It was almost embarrassing. A lot of times we'll get stuck behind cars, and I remember this one road very specifically. There was a 4-door sedan in front of us, your average car, and it was hitting corners almost as fast as I could on this Victory. So I was really not impressed. The limitations of this bike cornering are probably the worst part about it. I can have fun on almost any motorcycle, enjoying the limits of each bike and just enjoying the bikes for what they are. But on this Victory, the limits are so low that fun factor wears off very quickly, and I couldn't keep up to the R6, like not even close. And then we're also riding with a KTM 1190 Adventure, and they were doubling, and they had suitcases, lots of luggage. I was nowhere close to keeping up with the Adventure bike, even with mud tires on it. So trying to keep up with these two other bikes, it turned into more work than enjoyment. I found myself wide open on every single straight stretch, and then as hard as I could on the brakes into every single corner, and pushing the bike as hard as I could, and I would still fall very far behind chasing these other two bikes. So because this bike is very limited in the corners, I was really relying on the power of that 106 cubic inch engine to try and keep up, and it kind of fell short as well. If you've ever rode one of these bikes at altitude, I would say after 8,000 feet, they are very underpowered. It's a very heavy bike, and when you start losing power with altitude, when we were going through the Beartooth Pass, a lot of steep inclines, I found myself even second gear slow speeds wide open just to try and pass cars here and there, and it was working for it. And I'm a pretty light rider, 160 pounds. This bike was struggling at altitude. The other bikes were probably affected as well, but this bike with the weight, you really felt it. And I couldn't imagine a smaller engine. Like, I was milking this bike for everything it's worth. At sea level, I was pretty happy with the bike. Like, first 3 gears, it's got plenty of power, but once you get it out on the highway, 4th, 5th, and 6th, that's where it starts to feel underpowered when you're passing people. And on a lot of those curvy roads, you don't have a lot of time to pass. So you really have to kind of get a run at each vehicle and time out your passes perfectly. And then I also feel bad because the exhaust on this bike is so loud. If people are trying to enjoy the scenery, they have their windows open. I don't want to blast by their open windows with their family in the car, wide open throttle. I can just hear the pipes echoing behind me, crazy loud. So what I was doing, I was getting a run at each vehicle, wide open throttle, and then I would try and coast past their window and then back on the throttle again, just to try and be somewhat respectful. But yes, the exhaust on this bike got extremely annoying after a long day on the bike. So loud, even with earplugs in, you almost get a little bit of drone in your helmet after a long day, and didn't think the exhaust was that loud in town before I went on this road trip, but it got to me after 3 weeks. It's an extremely loud bike. All bark, no bite, really. So if you're not running high altitude, you'll probably be happy with the power. Like I said, anything over 7,000 feet, you're probably gonna be disappointed with the power. This bike usually starts to make power around 2,000 RPM. At altitude, I would run it over 3,000 RPM to get the same amount of power I had at 2,000 RPM, just to give you guys a rough idea. Felt like it lost all of its bottom end grunt, and that's kind of all this bike really has. It doesn't really rev out that nice in the top end, doesn't feel happy up there, but you have to rev it out if you're at altitude. That's just how it is. So with the low end torque of this bike, it wore out the rear tire extremely fast. These tires were brand new when I left, and the rear tire is completely bald. 6,000 kilometers, and the center section is completely worn out. The tire's garbage. Pretty embarrassing when a sport bike tire lasts longer than your cruiser. Did not expect that. This tire is starting to flat spot as well, and it's almost at the wear bars, but pretty embarrassing when a soft sport bike tire lasts longer than your cruiser. Now, if you were casually running this bike, probably what it's intended for, I think that rear tire would have lasted a lot longer, but because I was running it to the limit, wide open throttle, almost every single day for long periods of time, I think just the torque delivery of this bike and the weight really wore out that tire a lot faster. Just how the power is delivered to that tire, really low RPM. If I'm at 2,000 RPM, second gear, kind of just coming around a corner, the side of the tire, and you lean into throttle, you can almost feel each power pulse of the engine wanna break traction, and it kind of slips just a tiny bit, not breaking loose, but really causing accelerated wear on that tire. Now let's talk about the braking. So because every straight stretch, I was wide open to try and keep up with the sport bikes, I was heavy on the brakes every single corner entry. The Victory only has one brake caliper and rotor up front, and I was squeezing it as hard as I could with one finger, and that's not enough. I needed 2 fingers, and that really caused a lot of forearm pain, because when I'm holding the bars like this, 2 fingers for the brake, 2 on the throttle, hard on the brake, and then I was grabbing throttle with these 2, it caused a lot of forearm pain. And I noticed that within the first 20 minutes probably of pushing this bike hard. Way more pain in my wrists and forearms than on the sport bike, which I thought was very surprising, because the sport bikes are kind of hard on the wrists too, just because of how low the bars are and their positioning. But I would argue if you're pushing one of these cruisers to the limit, I was almost more fatigued on the cruiser, just with forearm pain and a little bit of upper back and shoulder pain with the high bars, really trying to manhandle this bike, and I'm a small guy. It took it out of me. I was tired. And I've never experienced shooting forearm pain kind of right down to the elbow on the sport bikes, ever. So I do think the brakes are underpowered for these bikes when you're pushing them hard. One thing I didn't like, when you're really heavy on the brakes, the suspension seems very easy to overwork. When you have all that weight on the front tire, front brake applied, you feel every little seam in the road. If you have a crease in the road that's following the tire, you almost get a little bit of speed wobble, like there's no steering damper on this bike. It feels very unstable, especially on uneven road surfaces. And any little bump or seam in the road, if you're max angle in a corner as well, sketchy on this thing. It almost wants to load the suspension in a corner, and if you hit a bump when you're kind of max lean on throttle or on brake, the bike almost doesn't know what to do. The suspension, I don't think, is made for that, and it gets a little squirrely on you. It's not a good feeling. Very easy to overwork the suspension on this bike and outride it. You feel the weight of this bike, and the suspension, it's kind of the bare minimum. It soaks up bumps, not too bad in a straight line, but even then, if you hit a really big lip in the highway, there's not much suspension travel in the rear either. Your back is the next thing in line, and you really feel it in your lower back. I almost felt it in my kidneys too, like it almost blows out your kidneys. I've got airtime on the back seat hitting bumps. It kind of just kicks you straight up. So suspension on this bike, subpar at best. And I always thought they were pretty stable, but yeah, like I said, without a steering damper and uneven road surfaces, pushing it to the limits, it gets speed wobble almost easier than the sport bikes. Even though the 600s don't come with steering dampers either, they feel more planted. Usually when you see a big bump coming up, like on the sport bikes, you'll just stand up on the pegs, take your butt off the seat, so you're not actually getting abused like you do on this bike. The foot pegs on this are very hard to stand on. You're kind of doing a pull-up almost on the bars to try and lift your butt off the seat. So you're just getting impacted a lot more on this, I feel like. Your body's just taking a little bit more abuse on this in certain road conditions. Casually cruising, better. Aggressively driving, worse. Now, I've never been one to complain about heat, but because this is an air-cooled engine, a lot of that air-cooled heat is blown directly onto your legs. Even if you're kind of spread eagle going down the highway, when we were going through Idaho, it was plus 37. There's really no break from the heat, even on the highway. Start and stop traffic, heat radiates a lot worse than a liquid-cooled sport bike. Not that big of a deal, but worth mentioning. I thought there were a few times where the excessive heat might start affecting performance. Didn't notice anything that way. These engines run pretty good. They kind of just keep chugging along. Heat doesn't seem to affect them that much. If you get caught in the rain, they're also not that comfortable. Your feet get wet immediately. Everything below the knees completely soaked. Arms, shoulders, they still get wet too. Feet are the worst of it. Even if it's not raining but the pavement's wet, the spray from the front tire completely soak your feet immediately. Another thing I noticed, these bikes are comfortable up to 110, 120 kilometers an hour, something like that. But when we were going through Montana and the speed limits are 80 miles an hour, this bike does not feel good going over 140, 150 kilometers an hour like that to kind of keep up with traffic. It's pretty sketchy when you're beside a semi or you're going around some of their big speed corners. The bike, even with the windshield on it, has a lot of wind buffeting, and we bombed on the highway for multiple hours just to kind of get where we were going. And that was just as fatiguing as some of the backcountry roads at lower speeds. So really did not feel good in the high speed zones. At those high speeds, any little bump in the road, the chassis would wiggle and kind of walk down some of the seams and stuff, and just did not feel that stable. The weight of the bike feels really planted at lower speeds, but the high speeds exaggerate how bad the suspension is on this bike. And when you're already going 140 and you want to try and pass somebody, getting up to 180, things like that, 190, you're hanging on for dear life. You pass and you almost want to slow right back down after you pass. Doing 200 on the sport bikes feels relatively safe. They're kind of made for those high speeds, very smooth. This bike is screaming. If you're holding it over 3,000 RPM, like 32, 3,500 RPM in those high speeds, it feels like you're gonna blow it up. It does not like it. Everything's vibrating. The bars are shaking. It almost feels like you're running an impact on its lowest setting, like the whole time, just shaking away. And this is a smooth running engine too, compared to a lot of V-twins. The more time I spent on this bike, the narrower of window I found it performs in. You don't want to be going too fast. You don't want to be going too slow. Even things like roundabouts, super slow speed roundabouts, I can drag peg and it's almost hard to merge with traffic, even coming out of a roundabout. So the window where this bike operates is very limited. So to sum up this video, if you're just looking for a casual cruiser, take back and forth to work, daily driver, something like that, it's a great bike, gets great fuel mileage. You want to take it to the odd car show here and there, gets tons of attention. You take this out for supper or whatever, you park it outside, every single person that walks by, they're looking at the bike, they're enjoying it, they're asking you questions about it, gets lots of attention. Good looking bike. Pretty well-rounded bike, I think, for a cruiser. It's just me personally and my riding style, it doesn't really suit my needs. I still really enjoy riding it, but even on road trips and for the back roads that we hit most of the time, I still prefer the sport bikes over the cruiser. I found myself more fatigued on this cruiser, just manhandling the weight, putting in way more brake effort, the arm pump and the fatigue in my forearms. Way more stressful just trying to keep up with everybody on this bike than if I just would have had a sport bike, crush the corners, get there fast, take more breaks. They're both fatiguing after a long day, just in very different ways. So it's kind of weird saying it, but for me, this still wasn't a comfortable bike traveling across country. For our next bike trip, I think I'm gonna eye up an MT10. Those seem to be a good balance between seating position, still leader bike performance. Of course, they're detuned and stuff from the normal R1s, but I think that would be better suited for my needs, still crush some of the corners, and just a better middle ground. Those bikes do seem to be pretty popular these days, and for good reason, right? They're not crazy expensive. They do everything fairly well, and I'm just excited to maybe shop for one here in the near future if I can sell this Victory. The wife was even thinking about picking up an MT-09 for our next trip. But if you guys have any other bike suggestions that might suit my needs a little better, drop them in the comments below. I love hearing from you guys. I try and read as many of your comments as I can. And I hope this video kind of gives you a better idea of what to expect out of a cruiser if you're coming off a crotch rocket or a sport bike of some kind. Like I said, it's a great bike, great value for what it is, but it really comes down to what you want to do with the bike. And for me, it just wasn't it. I will say my favorite part about it was probably just cruising in town, speed limits, and roll into the store with no helmet on because the States have no helmet laws, and I really enjoyed that part of it. Just kind of low and slow, baby. So hopefully you got some value out of this video. I really tried to bring my background from sport bike riding into the review on this cruiser. I feel like there's not a ton of other reviews like that on YouTube because I'm very passionate about the sport bike world. But at the end of the day, I'm still a bike enthusiast. I like trying new things. This was a great experience. I don't regret anything about it. For the price, pick one up, try it for yourself. And I just want to thank all you guys for watching these videos because it does help support the channel and it helps drive my passion in trying new things like this. So until next time, guys, we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks again.